Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Miloš Medjure, and I'll be talking to my colleague Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor that we publish every Friday alongside this podcast. Today we're going to start off with a brief roundup of all of our major developments happening in each of the hotspots that we cover, namely the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, before taking a quick look at some of the developments out of Latin America, the United Kingdom, and in the United States. Let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, what can you tell us about updates from the Middle East?
Thank you, Miloš, and good morning, everyone. So we saw a trend towards military escalation in the Middle East this week, and that might seem strange if you've just been sort of lightly following the news, because most of the headlines have been about peace negotiations between Iran and the United States, and there's a lot of optimism right now, at least publicly from American officials. But the reason for that, I think, at least my assessment, is the ongoing war in Lebanon. So the latest out of Lebanon is that there was intense fighting over the course of last weekend between the Israeli army and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. A number of Israeli soldiers were killed, which led to significant retaliation from Israel and the bombardment of several population centers in southern Lebanon that killed dozens of people. Shortly after that very sharp spike in escalation, there was yet another ceasefire agreed to out of the ongoing talks between Israel and Lebanon, direct talks, I should say, being mediated in DC right now. That ceasefire was observed relative to this scenario, right, within the context of this specific war, more so than we've seen with the previous, at this point, 3 or 4 ceasefire announcements, right? But of course, context is very important here. That lasted only 12 hours or so. There's been a series of escalations since then, direct fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, intense Israeli bombardment of cities and villages in the south of Lebanon. Thousands of Lebanese soldiers are currently surrounding a large underground complex, which is believed to house dozens of Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon. It's reminiscent of a similar scenario that we saw in Gaza previously, again, and that was also in a so-called ceasefire scenario, right? So when we talk about a ceasefire in Lebanon, what are we really talking about, right? Let's just say, for example, that there was no shooting or bombing and the ceasefire was more or less actually being observed by both the IDF and by Hezbollah. Well, in reality, if we say thousands of soldiers surrounding an underground complex, that's a siege, right? There might not be active shooting at the moment, but that is a siege of enemy combatants, right? And that's something that can escalate. Some very notable statements from senior Israeli leaders over this week, from Netanyahu himself, who said that Israel will maintain its occupation of Lebanon, quote, for as long as necessary, and the defense minister, Israel Katz, who said basically the same thing. We will not withdraw from Lebanon. And he went so far as to say, even if there is a direct American demand, they won't do it. Now, all of this is happening as there's a very different tone coming out of Washington, right? In particular from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. The specific focus of the talks right now that should still be ongoing today, although I'll note that that very well may change by the time this podcast comes out, but is what they're calling a pilot program of an exchange of territory, a handover of territory from the Israeli army to the Lebanese army. And the idea is that the Lebanese army will demonstrate that it is capable of maintaining security in that area, aka denying it from Hezbollah, and then they will expand from there. The U.S. is assuring the Israelis that any Lebanese soldiers involved in this so-called pilot program will be trained and vetted by the United States. The Lebanese army is a partner force of the United States, and the U.S. has been involved in its training and its funding and its equipping for a very long time. So that's not necessarily reinventing the wheel there. Will that be enough to reassure the Israelis? Probably not, and even if it were, and we've lightly touched on this in the past few weeks, but what's really driving Israeli foreign policy in Lebanon right now is domestic politics, especially in the case of Netanyahu, and from his perspective, the disastrous political fallout from being cut out of negotiations and the deal, the MOU rather, that the U.S. struck with Iran. So all that being said, despite ongoing negotiations, and there was also reports of more fire against ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. There's a lot of conflicting reporting on that right now. But again, it's just one of many examples where it's a very, I don't even want to say it, a tense situation. There's active fighting right now. And the Iranians have made it very, very clear that this is something that can completely derail the ongoing negotiations with the United States.
Yeah, we spoke last week about how much emphasis the US put on the ceasefire extending to Lebanon, and how there might be some, spoilers to that de-escalatory process, as indeed we're seeing now. Do you think that the US is going to ramp up its pressure on Israel at all, or are you seeing any signs of that?
We are seeing signs of that, actually. We just mentioned some notable statements from the Israelis, but perhaps more notable are statements from the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who has been very publicly critical of the Israelis and of Netanyahu in particular. So politically right now in the United States, the stage is absolutely set for that trend to continue, right? For a number of domestic reasons that we don't have the time to get into on this particular podcast. But yeah, it's really a question of to what extent will the United States continue to exert significant pressure on the Israeli government, because there's many factions within the Israeli government right now are pushing for not just a continued war in Lebanon, but an escalation of the current war. So that places Netanyahu in a rock and a hard place right now. We'll keep our eye on all that. There's a lot happening, on an hourly basis. That's the latest that people should be aware of significant updates in the Middle East right now, at least those that specifically affect the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran. So let's pivot over to Europe and check on the status of transatlantic relations with the United States and its NATO allies and the war in Ukraine. We've seen a trend towards military escalation over the last few weeks that has continued up until now. There's been a lot of tension lately between Ukraine and Belarus over their shared border. That's definitely nothing new. That's been the case, of course, since the beginning of the invasion. In Ukraine itself, there's always concern, and they have to take it seriously, the possibility of some sort of a ground incursion from Belarus, right? Typically, I think there's a lot of bluster there, both from Putin and from Lukashenko when it comes to that. Again, it's something that the Ukrainians always have to take seriously. But this past week, it's been a little bit different, actually. So there's communications equipment currently placed along the Ukrainian-Belarusian border that is being used to support the Russian war effort, and specifically Russian strikes into Ukrainian cities. I mean, that infrastructure is probably all across Belarus, but the current tensions are specifically on this signals equipment along the border. So what happened is that Zelensky issued an ultimatum to Lukashenko saying, you have 1 week to remove this equipment from the border or we will do it ourselves, essentially, is what he said, but threatened direct action inside Belarus. I either today or tomorrow we're coming up on that 1 week timeline. I think that President Zelensky is perhaps a little tighter with his timelines than President Trump when it comes to issuing threats. That remains to be seen. But again, that there's potential there for, I don't know if I would say significant escalation, but new escalation, if that makes sense.
Do you think there's a risk of this war opening up a second front on the Belarusian border?
Oh, I think there's been a risk of a second front opening up in several places in Europe. Right. For a number of reasons, but primarily the Russians have been very aggressive and increasingly aggressive, and these gray zone hybrid attacks across Europe, and not just in the cyber realm either, but like kinetic bombings, sabotage of railroads in Poland, that sort of thing. They've become increasingly aggressive with that, and more incursions of drones into Baltic and NATO airspace, and that's the kind of thing that can easily be miscalculated. Right. So there's instances happening all the time that leave that possibility open. Now, as far as that's always from the perspective of Russian aggressive action, right? Here, yes, there is the possibility that the Ukrainians could take, I think, some limited direct action. We started this conversation talking about how the Ukrainians have to take that threat seriously from Belarus, but that works both ways.
And the Ukrainians have been demonstrating their increased capability of precision strikes, essentially, against long-range targets, including, mostly focusing on energy and transport infrastructure. And I think if I were in the Belarusian decision-making circle, I'd be keenly keeping an eye on movement from that side, from Ukraine.
Yeah, 100%. And going off what you mentioned right there about the long distance strikes, we need to note that has also continued into this week. Listeners most certainly have seen footage out of recent Ukrainian strikes in Moscow. Very dramatic footage of, especially against a particular oil refinery in the Moscow area. That's getting a lot of attention. One, because that is a significant escalation. They're hitting Moscow more and in a more serious way than they have at any point in the war, with the exception of the last couple of months. What's not getting as much attention is the Ukrainian escalation and the success of their long-distance strike campaign in Crimea. Right, the Ukrainians have said publicly, our goal is to sever Crimea from Russian territory via the ground. That has not occurred yet. I think that the Ukrainians are on their way to achieving that objective, but there's no question that Russian infrastructure, military infrastructure, and energy infrastructure across the occupied territory of Crimea is coming more consistently under bombardment than it has at any point in the war to date.
Yeah, and it seems from statements from Zelensky that they are not going to be stopping those strike campaigns anytime soon. I think Zelensky himself said that it's going to continue for a while still, until Russia makes a conceited effort to come to the negotiating table.
Yeah, and the negotiations have been going nowhere, to be frank. We just need to acknowledge that there's been some interesting, and that's not an update. That's been the case for several months now. the Russians in their official talking points like to cite the Anchorage summit, the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska several months ago. Nothing ever came of that. Again, that's not really an update. But because they cite it so often, I believe Rubio himself recently came out and said there was nothing was agreed to. There were concepts of an agreement, but nothing was agreed to there. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has also recently said that negotiations are going nowhere. Again, none of that is new. What is new and interesting is that at a NATO summit on June 24th, Trump offered Zelensky some rare praise, saying that he is, quote, winning now against Russia, which is very interesting. Trump says himself often, he likes a winner, right? That might be, and I don't mean that glibly. He does, and the Ukrainians know that, and so something like that might just be like a very brief comment in a press conference, I think, is something that the Ukrainians are probably looking at as a diplomatic opening. I think it's a fairly significant comment, actually, from Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll recall the infamous White House meeting where he basically told Zelensky last year that he, quote, held none of the cards. And it seems that in the past year, he, at the very least, seems open to changing his mind. As you mentioned, very notable coming from Trump.
It seems that they do indeed have some cards, but those are my updates for my sections. So I'll kick it over to you to see what's going on in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, let's turn to the Indo-Pacific. So overall, stayed fairly stable this week, but we did see some trends pointing towards that hybrid escalation scenario ramping up again. The main reason for that being that China added 2 companies from the United States linked to the rare earth industry to its sanctions list. And now the 2 companies in question are called USA Rare Earths and MP Materials. And these are 2 companies that we've talked about in the past, specifically because in an effort to diversify from China's grip on rare earth exports, the US has been signing a lot of, the US government, that is, has been signing a lot of agreements with its own industry to develop that capability to not only mine, but also process rare earths indigenously, right? So without needing the help from any foreign partner, and especially not from China. And this means that the US government has been giving a lot in grants and subsidies to the industry as a whole, but these 2 companies have been quite at the forefront of that. So as a result, China this week has gone ahead and put these on its sanctions list. Now, I should note, this is in retaliation to a similar move that we saw by Washington last week, where we saw both the Department of Commerce but also the Department of Defense adding a multitude of Chinese companies to their own respective lists. In the Department of Commerce's case, it's specifically the sanctions, but in the DoD's case, it's more of a list that designates certain Chinese companies as being affiliated with the Chinese military, and therefore restricts what can and can't be done with regards to relations with the United States. So this retaliatory move from China is largely symbolic in a sense. We're seeing that they're not going too far with their escalatory moves. This is more of keeping the balance. And I should remind everyone that we are keeping an eye out for September. There will be a new summit between Presidents Trump and Xi in Washington. So as a result, it's likely that there's not going to be too much escalation between now and then. But we are going to be keeping on seeing these little tit-for-tat moves. In a similar vein, we also saw that China is reportedly considering adding another rare earth to its export control list. In this case, it's indium. And this could have implications across multiple sectors, as always. Now, this just means that for now, China is upping its due diligence as to where the indium gets exported to. It's asking its domestic suppliers to provide an increased count of the stockpiles that they have, probably in an efforts to prioritize domestic consumption. Indium is also found in certain compounds like indium phosphide, which was put on the restricted list by China last year and had a number of implications, especially in the semiconductor industry. We saw in the last Trump Xi meeting in May, we saw the head of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, go along to Beijing, in an effort to keep the export flowing of rare earths. And for now, it seems that China is considering to tighten this export control, but at the same time, again, it's not seeking to escalate things too harshly. So we are going to be keeping an eye on these kind of tit-for-tat moves, but for now it's more of a keeping the balance rather than any kind of escalatory move. Shifting to a different theatre related to the Indo-Pacific, we did see that the European Union is looking to impose tariffs on electric vehicles imported from China, and this is part of a wider push to first and foremost decrease the trade deficit that the EU has with China, which is quite substantial. If I'm not mistaken, it's approximately in the 300 billion euro mark, which the EU has been seeking to de-risk from for a number of years, but now has regained some impetus on that front. There's also the added fact that the EU is looking to tighten its cybersecurity laws and its regulations with regards to what technology it lets into the bloc. And as a result, there's been a number of meetings from the European Commission in which certain proposals have been put on the table, notably this last one regarding tariffs. But there's also others, including the imports of technology from the solar industry. So keeping an eye on developments there. And then keeping it in the tech fields, China overtook the United States in a supercomputer capability contest for the first time. And this specifically measured the processing speed and capability. And the last time that the US wasn't the first place was around 3 years ago. But this is quite a notable development, as we know that China is seeking to develop not only its supremacy in the tech front with regards to the United States, but also that capability of chasing technological advancements indigenously, so without any imports. And as it turns out, this supercomputer is the first time that it used completely indigenously produced chips from Huawei. So definitely a notable development. Now, there are some questions remaining how the supercomputer compares to the US's own capabilities in other domains other than processing speed, but certainly a milestone that we're keeping an eye on. And then finally, we are keeping an eye on military developments. We saw that Taiwan held a week-long combat readiness drill across joint domains to try and update its resilience and update the military realities of what an invasion from China could look like. And as it turns out, China sailed its most advanced aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait, which was the first time it had done so in a couple of months. So the timing probably coincides with the drills. And China likes to routinely put on displays of force against Taiwan, although I should note that daily incursions into the air defense identification zone are still occurring. So all things we're keeping an eye on, namely that hybrid escalation front, is key at the moment, and we'll certainly be providing updates in the next couple of weeks as that comes along. But that's about it for the Indo-Pacific. Turning now to other parts of the world, we've been keeping an eye on Latin America, where in Colombia, we saw the results of the election that was held last week, where the far-right candidate won Colombia's presidential election with 49% of the vote, beating his leftist opponent. De la Espriella vowed to end all talks with rebel groups, reduce the size of the state, as well as expand the fossil fuel sector. Shifting now to Bolivia, we saw that President Rodrigo Paz declared a state of emergency last week and mobilized the military against anti-government protesters that have blocked major urban roadways for the past 7 weeks. Protesters are demanding an end to austerity measures and a resumption of fuel subsidies. And the government has asserted that the protests are aimed at destabilizing the country and of acting in support of the former leader, Evo Morales, who is currently in hiding after he was charged with human trafficking, an accusation that Morales denies. So keeping an eye out on that political and security destabilization in the country. And speaking of political destabilization in the United Kingdom, we saw that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, announced that he would resign as leader of the Labour Party government and as Prime Minister, following the victory by former Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham in a special parliamentary election. Burnham has stated his ambitions of succeeding Starmer, and his victory follows a series of resignations by Starmer's cabinet, including the Ministers of Health, Defence and Armed Forces. Formal nominations for a successor to Starmer open on July 9th, with prospects high that Burnham takes the leadership role unchallenged by his peers. And then finally, in the United States, the Trump administration has asked the US Congress to pass a supplemental funding package that would provide nearly $88 billion to help replenish munitions that were expended during the Iran war, among other operational costs. The request also includes around $11 billion in aid for US farmers and around $1.5 billion to combat the Ebola outbreak concentrated in the DRC. So we'll probably come back to you with updates on how that request is going next week. But that's all we have time for this week, and with that we'll wrap it up. As a reminder to all of our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to these topics, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thanks, Andrew, for joining me. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.